Tell me a little bit about how you came to start a company like Fingerprint for Success and your experience.
Yeah, so my very first business was started in 1997. I was one of the very first professional coaches in Australia, and I ended up building 3 different divisions. So an executive corporate coaching division, with contracts with banks, and then a division with personal coaching. And then I developed this really unusual division, which I ended up giving myself to for the last 22 years, which is working with what I call our creative artists. So actors, writers, producers, inventors, and entrepreneurs. And through that process, I started to notice that with all the entrepreneurs I was working with, I was helping them with their startup, their scaling up phase, and helping them with funding and various different other things. And I noticed that those who were going on to have significant, what we call an exit, and those who were failing, there was different motivations between the 2 groups. So I had a hypothesis that there was a correlation between people's attitudes and motivations and their business outcomes. So I did 2 world first studies, and we've then commercialised that into this technology platform to be able to make the insights rich and available to people who are starting businesses and people who are organising innovative startup teams.
So can you tell us about the science behind Fingerprint for Success?
So we've conducted 2 world first studies. The very first one was of Australian startup founders, and we were looking at something that you might be familiar with from Jim Collins. He's written the book Good to Great, and they did like a 15-year study looking at the top performers over time versus those who were low performers. So it's called a comparison study. So we looked at successful founders who started and sold their businesses within a 5-year period for between 6 million and 1.2 billion. And then we looked at a group of founders who'd actually failed and gone bankrupt. Then we looked at a third group of people, which were the Australian corporate workforce. And we had a hypothesis that there were certain attitudes that were correlated with early stage venture success and with innovation as a result of that. And so we ran this analysis, and it was a very difficult study to do to get access to that population. It's considered a hidden population. And we found some significant correlations. So we spent 4.5 years applying those findings to over 1,000 business owners as case studies to see if you have these insights, does it make any difference? If you're mentored and coached with these insights, what kind of a difference does it make? And it was a significant difference. So we commercialised the research and launched a platform in 2016, which makes those findings accessible and available to everybody. And then in 2018, we partnered with the Startup Genome, which is a global research firm on startups and, importantly, startup ecosystems. They're out of San Francisco, and we studied founders in 55 cities looking at similar things to what we looked at in the very first study. And again, we found significant correlations.
So you've got a lot of experience working with innovative teams. What does a successful innovation culture look like?
Yeah, it's a super good question. So what we learned from our research, and then in the last 9 years of applying those findings, what we learned was that innovation comes from a mindset of experimentation. So what we measure in F4S for experimentation is that when you approach a project, where do you want to jump in? Do you want to organise and plan the project? Do you want to conceptualise the project, or do you want to just roll up your sleeves and figure it out by validation, experimentation, and that way? And you, of course, know, because of how innovative all the work is that you do, is that innovation to step in and experiment versus the corporate executive cultures that are non-innovative. They want to start with structure and planning everything without any validation that they're even onto something. So that's one of the factors.
Yeah, I think that's a really big factor in corporate innovation is even meeting that barrier to success, right? Like, what are the fundamental things that you need to be able to do in terms of environment, in terms of team motivation, alignment, to be able to get that result? And I think that's why the culture of Fingerprint for Success, like the culture mapping that Fingerprint for Success can bring, is so vitally important.
Yeah.
I mean, how much of innovation would you say is culture?
Oh, dramatic. So we just finished today running analysis on one of the most exciting companies in the world at the moment, who's in the autonomous vehicle environment. And we were looking at their culture, and we could immediately see just stark differences between the traditional executive corporate workforce. And so some of the things that we find is, for example, when teams approach tasks, do they want to approach them using a proven step-by-step procedure? Or do they want to invent the process of how to do the task themselves?
So one of the things that I find really compelling about Fingerprint for Success is its focus on motivation. And in my experience in the innovation space, the motivation of the team is one of the fundamental factors of success. And so having used Fingerprint for Success model myself, I found that it's sort of like adds a vocabulary to be able to go, oh yeah, that person's internally referenced, or that person's not really big on tools, and you can start to really like see it clearly. And so I think that's a really big deal.
Yeah.
What's been your experience of that effect of being able to talk about the motivation framework of people in relation to delivering innovation?
Yeah, so very often innovation is classed as this magical thing that some organisation has and some organisation hasn't. And what we know is innovation is made up of human beings.
Yeah.
And yes, there's technology involved, whether it be a methodology or actual hard tech. But what we know is that it's the humans that bring to life new things. Now, our definition in F4S of innovation is a motivation for what we measure in F4S, which is called evolution. And evolution is the motivation to incrementally take something that exists in the world and then to incrementally improve and iterate on it. Versus what we would call revolutionary changes, which is a motivation for doing brand new things that are revolutionary, that have never been done before. And these are humans' everyday's motivations at work. And when you create an environment that attracts those individuals and that you can actually use language to know how to identify that in individuals, we can actually find high potential innovators in every organisation.
Yeah, that's a great point.
If you know how to, one, identify it, or what we've done is we've taken the guesswork out of it so that you can actually scientifically measure it and discover those high potentials sitting in your team.
So in my experience, the motivation of individual team members needs to be mapped to the environment, and when you can do that effectively, you see outsized results. What's an example of how that's played out in reality for you?
Yeah, so one of the big things that is a proliferator of innovation inside small teams like startups or large enterprises is how the organisation relates to rules. So for us, rules might be the values or the implied customs or the explicit rules of how you're meant to operate and how a good employee works in this environment. And one of the things we measure is what we call indifference. Indifference means I'm indifferent to rules. I don't see rules. I'm not constrained by them. When I'm working on a problem or a challenge at work, I'm not constrained by the rule book of how the problem's been solved in the past. So when we see high indifference, they're the most innovative, creative people that we can find. They're the ones who, invented the Airbnb, Uber, but more locally, the things that really change our environments. And so when you take somebody like that, they do not thrive in a corporate environment that's motivated by compliance, which says this is how it's done in this environment and this is the pen you've got to play within. Now, in certain cultures, for quality assurance and those sorts of things, compliance is absolutely critical. But if we're wanting to unlock innovation and we go and find a highly innovative individual, they will not conform. Not because they're trying to be rude or disrespectful. They don't see the requests and expectations as I have to meet those. So therefore, they're creative, innovative, disruptive, and a great team member, but in the wrong environment, the two are just going to clash.